For the first time in over a millennium, the capital was moved from Kyoto to Edo, modern-day Tokyo. The finally unified Japan isolates itself from the rest of the world. It will not be seen by foreigners for the next 250 years. The new centralized government established a system of feudalism in which the samurai class were granted privileges in exchange for their loyalty and service to the shogunate. The new Edo government also pursued a policy of isolationism, in which it limited foreign trade and contact with the outside world. This protected the island nation from foreign invasion and influence, but held the country back economically. The shogunate's main aim was to keep the peace. Swords were confiscated from everyone who was not samurai, imposed a strict class hierarchy, and closed Japan to any and all foreigners. For over 200 years, the Tokugawa family ruled this insular nation that would see no one enter nor leave, save a few Dutch merchants. The country was unified, but not centralized, as the 300 or so daimyo had the right to set their own tax rates, and taxes were paid in goods as opposed to being paid in central currency. This meant that as recently as the early 1800s, Japanese society was more akin to medieval and feudal Europe. In the transition from the century of war to the ensuing 3 centuries of peace, the samurai no longer fought as warriors, but rather spent their time practicing kendo, writing poetry, and collecting taxes, essentially reverting to their Heian-era origin of bureaucratic servitude. During the Edo period, Japan experienced rapid economic growth and urbanization, which led to the rise of the merchant class and ukiyo culture. The city of Edo, now known as Tokyo, was the center of political power in Japan, as it was the seat of Tokugawa shogunate. As such, it was a bustling and vibrant city divided into distinct districts lined with oil lanterns swinging in the breeze. Wooden houses with sliding paper doors which would have been home to merchants, artisans, and common people, as well as samurai. The clang of bells could be heard from the high-up Shinto shrines, sweet wafts of burning incense, and drifting through the narrow streets as people and priests alike prayed and made offerings to their kami and ancestors. The smell of food would have hung in the air, with vendors lining the streets selling grilled meats, bowls of rice and noodles. Markets around every corner, with stores selling fine silk kimono fabric, household items and fresh produce. If you were lucky, you would stumble upon a store selling a woodblock print by Hiroshige or Hokusai and buy one to add to your growing collection displayed on the walls of your home. On a fine evening, you may have wandered into a playhouse and sat among the crowd as kabuki actors in elaborate costumes and colorful makeup, pull faces and feign exaggerated movements in time to the beating drums of musicians. They tell stories of old Japan, of the victory of the Minamoto over the Taira, the defeat of the invading Mongol armies, of the daring escapades of Prince in Love, and of battles and betrayals of brave samurai. During the summer, the daimyo's banners would be spotted on the horizon. The procession of a daimyo would always bring much celebration with the musicians, dancers, and soldiers in tow, in a lavish display of wealth, authority, and status. Protected by a surrounding outer wall, the city must have felt like a haven. During the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, the emperors of Japan were not necessarily powerful political figures, but they were important cultural and artistic figures who played a significant role in shaping the arts and culture of Japan during this time. The emperor of the Edo period had been patrons of the arts and often supported the development of many new styles of art and literature. Keen to strengthen the philosophical study of Buddhism, they commissioned the construction of many temples and shrines. The two main religions of Edo Japan were Buddhism and Shinto. Shinto, which translates as Way of the Gods, is traditional Japanese religion based on the worship of kami, who are gods or spirits linked to nature and natural phenomena. Buddhism, which arrived from China in the 6th century, believed that suffering was caused by desire and enlightenment could be achieved through the practice of moral and ethical principles and meditation. Both religions coexisted in Japan in the Edo era, and many people practiced both religions, in syncretism recognized as 神仏集合. For the last 250 years, Japan had been ruled by a feudal government, separated into autonomous reigns controlled by daimyo, beholden to the shogun in Tokyo. The emperors still held court at Kyoto, but served as little more than a ceremonial figurehead. When the Dutch had arrived in Japan in the 16th century, they had likened the emperor's position to that of Pope, with the daimyo holding similar power to the feudal kings of Europe. However, by the mid-19th century, there were a number of threats against the shogunate. Japan was facing a number of internal and external challenges, including foreign intervention and pressure to modernize. Daimyo grew discontented over the handling of foreign affairs. Groups of samurai began speaking out against the shogun. Known as the shishi, they congregated around the imperial court and Emperor Komei. But then Komei died in 1867 at just 36 years old. His successor, the teenage Meiji, was enthroned. The disappearance of Komei from the political landscape and the installation of a young, impressionable emperor was an opportune moment for the shishi and forces loyal to the imperial court. The rebels marched to Edo, and eventually, the last Tokugawa shogun was overthrown. The rebels struggled at first to consolidate power. The successful revolutionaries managed to organize themselves into a council of state, and so began Japan's rapid reform and modernization. The rest of the world watched on as Japan opened its borders for the first time in almost 3 centuries. Its rapid transformation into a modern, industrialized nation would challenge the traditional balance of power across the rest of Asia. Looking to the west, Japan saw the expansion of the British, Spanish, French, and Dutch empires. Japan wanted to be the next great imperial power. A number of sweeping reforms were enacted, including the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, with the emperor as the ceremonial head of state and bicameral parliament called the Imperial Diet. They also established a modern legal system based on the codes of European powers and introduced a number of economic and social reforms. We had taken centuries for the Western world to achieve. Under Meiji rule, Japan managed to transform from a near-medieval feudal society into a modern industrialized nation in mere decades. The 300 or so daimyo-controlled domains were transformed into 70 prefectures. With the abolishment of the feudal system, the samurai grew increasingly obsolete. So became bureaucrats, teachers, and artists. Boys and girls alike were sent to school in a system of universal education, with the aim of creating a more educated and modern workforce, and many young Japanese were sent abroad to study in Western countries, in order to learn about the latest technologies and ideas and bring them back to their home nation. Men adopted modern Western clothing or yofuku, woven on coal-powered machine looms. Wealthy women, dressed in Victorian-style dresses imported from Europe, boarded newly constructed steam trains that traversed the mountainous Japanese countryside, ferrying people from city to city. The boom of TNT from coal mines could be heard as the train chugged through the mountains, billows of steam mingling with the cool mists. The aggressive military expansion was fueled by threats to their independence from the West. Under the policy of Fukoku Kyohei, which means enrich the country, strengthen the military, Japanese society transformed to facilitate economic, political modernization and private enterprise. In the upheaval, many traditional Japanese practices were abandoned in favor of westernization and modernization. Within a generation, Japan had become a preeminent force in the Pacific. Meiji had been a teenager when the forces loyal to the Imperial house overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate. By the turn of the century, the emperor had 15 children, though most died in infancy and only one of his sons lived to adulthood. The Meiji government believed it needed a way to unify national identity to fortify Japan against external influence and compete on the world stage. The emperor makes Shinto the state religion and proclaims himself and his heirs and living god as descendants of Amaterasu, the sun kami herself. The result was a cultivated national fanaticism that was backed up by myth inherited from the Shinto creation myth. Through state-sponsored propaganda and implication of state Shinto beliefs, this myth was exploited by the Meiji and subsequent emperors, consolidating the emperor as Arahitogami, or living god. In 1872, the Emperor Meiji decided to cut off his top knot and move to Western-style clothing. Empress Shoken, however, did not adopt Western clothing until much later, and only 1886 did she choose to swap her traditional kimono for Western-style dress. The emergence of Japan as an imperial power in the East began with the aggressive military expansion. The Meiji Constitution was enacted, turning Japan into a quasi-absolute monarchy with representative democracy. Newly industrialized and militarized, Japan invaded the island of Taiwan, which they called Formosa. Ryukyu Islands and Chinese Manchuria were incorporated into the Empire Japan during the Meiji era. Tensions erupted in 1894 over these annexations and resulted in a series of wars fought between China and Japan. The Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 had ended China's role as protectorate of the Korean Peninsula, opening the door for Japanese influence over trade and politics. Following Japan's surprising victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Japan established economic and military dominance in Korea, and the country was formally annexed in 1910. In order to establish control over its new protectorate, a war was waged against Korean language, culture, and often people. Life under Japanese imperial rule was brutal. School forced to teach Japanese and emphasized the importance of hard labor and reverence of the Japanese emperor. Japanese authorities burned countless Korean historical documents and texts, effectively erasing the historical memory of Korea. Taisho died, and it was his son and regent, Hirohito, who inherited the Chrysanthemum throne.
On Christmas Day 1926, the reigning Emperor Taisho was dead. Our imperial father has passed away. Mournful and heavy-hearted, we have succeeded to the imperial line. With our limited gifts, we are mindful of the difficulty of proving ourselves equal to the great task. Simplicity instead of vain display, originality instead of blind imitation, friendship to all nations, these are the aims to which we address ourselves. At 25, Hirohito was Emperor of Japan.
Emperor Showa, known in the West by his given name, Hirohito, was the 124th Emperor of Japan, reigning from December 25, 1926 until his death on January 7, 1989.
In the Western world's 20th century after Christ, Japan stood at the threshold of a new era. The cult of emperor worship was appropriated by a small but powerful militarist clique, which adopted the doctrine of extending Japan's borders by force if necessary.
Continuing Japan's aggressive military expansion, Japan invaded Manchuria in the aftermath of the Mukden incident, followed by the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War.
With this growing support of the militarists, the Japanese Empire moved closer and closer to a large-scale war. A war which might well involve all the peoples of Eastern Asia and Oceania.
Against an inadequately armed neighbor. Within a year, they had overrun the rich Chinese provinces of Manchuria and consolidated their gains. They then proceeded to give the world a foretaste of what it means to be conquered by Japanese.
As the Second World War breaks out in Europe, Japanese imperial forces invaded French Indochina.
It came because Nazi Germany was determined to flourish not by trading peacefully with its neighbors, but by ruthless aggression and conquest.
Though initially against Nazi Germany due to their support of China, Japan wanted to continue expanding and saw rebuilding a relationship with Germany a means to their desired end, empire. Japan became directly involved in the conflict that came to be known as the Second World War in 1941, when they launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. Faced with severe oil shortages and diminished supplies of other natural resources, the Japanese were driven by the ambition to displace the United States as the dominant Pacific power. This was an astounding victory for the Japanese imperial forces, who then allied with Nazi Germany. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, schools in Japan were charged to produce children of the emperor, willing to sacrifice themselves for the nation and the imperial house. Schools indoctrinated students, preaching fealty to the emperor, obedience to the imperial system, and the divine descent of the emperor. Even years before the war, children had been instructed in school that dying for the emperor transformed one into a deity. Building on the Meiji propaganda and in accordance with the Shinto creation myth that the Japanese emperors are divine beings, a cult-like worship of the emperor as a divine being stretches beyond the education system.
The emperor is the son of heaven, a lineal descendant of the sun goddess, who 2,600 years ago ordered the empire of Japan created on earth. Thus, to his subjects, Naruhito is not only emperor, but God, the divine head of a divinely created empire, the master and owner of all things Japanese.
The samurai code of conduct, Bushido, was revived and used in the indoctrination of the Japanese to militarism to present war as purifying and death a duty.
In learning to read and write the complex Japanese language of more than 4,000 characters, there is stern discipline for the mind. Never are they allowed to forget that the way of Japan is the way of the warrior, and that modern weapons of war are as glorious.
What tragedies, what horrors, what crimes has Hitler and all that Hitler stands for brought upon Europe and the world. The concentration camps are overcrowded. Every dawn, the firing parties are at their work. A vile race of quislings use a new word which will carry the sword of mankind down the centuries. Inspired
Year of 1940 gets underway, with England and France hard-pressed at home and the old enemy Russia taken into the camp of Tokyo's great and good friend Nazi Germany. Japan's ambitious militarists predict better times ahead.
We possess the strongest Navy and Air Force in the Far East. We have occupied China and command its air and seas. And now is a psychological moment, with European influence weakened by war, to settle once and for all the South Pacific question.
The Japanese city of Hiroshima had escaped damage in U.S. bombing raids on the home islands. On that sunny August morning, Hiroshima had no premonition of its fate.
That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed.
Hirohito's role during World War II is a controversial and complex issue. Was both the sovereign of the state and the imperial forces. As the symbolic head of the Japanese government, Hirohito was responsible for approving the decision of his advisors. These advisors, who were often military leaders, played a significant role in shaping Japan's foreign and domestic policies. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan's military leaders pushed for an expansionist foreign policy, including the invasion and occupation of other countries in Asia. Hirohito approved these operations, but the extent of his understanding of the details, or indeed the consequences of these decisions, remains unclear. For example, he is reported to have been involved in the decision to go to war with the United States, and he also approved the use of biological weapons against Chinese soldiers and civilians. Despite the ambiguity of his role in the conflict, Hirohito was not held responsible for Japan's actions during the war. In fact, he was allowed to retain his positions as emperor after Japan's surrender in 1945. The decision was made by the occupying forces, led by the United States, as a way to maintain stability in Japan during the post-war reconstruction. The United States believed that retaining the imperial system with Hirohito as the symbolic head would be the best way to achieve stability, but the power and role of emperor was reduced significantly in the post-war period.
As it turned out, this early flare-up was just the preliminary for the main event. The emperor in 1947 had made a formal appearance before the Diet to announce that the newly conceived Japanese constitution had outlawed war for all time. But apparently that was to apply to everyone except the nation's congressmen. Although Japan presented a united front to the world, internally she was torn by the disunity of two major political factions, the liberals and the progressives, against the minority Socialist Party. These cheers were for the emperor, not his government.
The 1947 Japanese Constitution, which was drafted by the occupying forces, defined the emperor as a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power. Stripping the emperor of all political power and giving more power to the country's Diet, Japan's two-house legislature. This also marked a significant shift from the pre-war understanding of the emperor as a divine figure with absolute authority, and Hirohito was forced to address the Japanese people, admitting that he was just a regular human and not actually a deity.
He denied his divinity. After years of being worshipped as a god, he still receives the adulation of millions of his people.
Though many people in Japan and internationally thought he should have been punished for the hand he had in Japan's imperial war efforts, for the remainder of his life, Hirohito played a ceremonial role as an emperor, and he was widely respected in Japan for his efforts to promote peace and reconciliation.
Making a trip to the Kurikama National Hospital at Uraga, the emperor visits with repatriated Japanese. On this precedent-shattering occasion, Hirohito conversed with many of his subjects, very different from the days when his people were even forbidden to look upon the sacred presence.
He died in 1989, and his son, Emperor Akihito, succeeded him as the 125th Emperor of Japan. Following the constitutional changes brought into effect following the end of the Second World War, Akihito's education was broadened to include training in English language and in Western culture. Breaking a 1,500-year-old tradition. In the 1950s, the then Crown Prince Akihito married a commoner, Shoda Michiko, who had been the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Their first child, Crown Prince Naruhito, was born in 1960, followed by another son, Akishino, and a daughter, Nori. Emperor Akihito ascended to the Chrysanthemum throne in 1989 upon the death of his father. Akihito and Michiko traveled the world together as representatives of goodwill for Japan.
Japanese signs bid a royal welcome to special visitors from Tokyo. Arriving in Buenos Aires is Prince Akihito and his wife, Princess Michiko. They've come for a 4-day state visit to Argentina. The Argentine Director of Protocol and the Japanese Ambassador are among the welcoming dignitaries.
Prince William has been welcomed by the Emperor of Japan and has met one of its most famous sumo wrestlers.
This was a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity for Japan, and as such, his reign was named Heisei, or Achieving Peace.
「要するにお元気なうちに次の代のことを考えるのが不敬である」いうそういう意見がものすごく強いんですよ。日本人はリセットするのが大好きなんですよ。ね、そして一つの時代を区切るのにやっぱりね、その言語を当てた元禄時代とかね、文化文政の時代とかね、そういう言い方するでしょ。
晴れ渡った空の下、皆さんと共に新年を祝うことを誠に嬉しく思います。本年が少しでも多くの人にとり、良い年となるよう願っています。年頭にあたり、我が国と世界の人々の安寧と幸せを祈ります。
Though constitutionally barred from abdicating the throne, the 85-year-old Emperor Akihito received special legal permission from the government to step down from his role, stating that he felt unable to fulfill his role because of declining health. In 2016, Emperor Akihito announced that he would abdicate the throne in favor of his eldest son Naruhito. Three years later, Akihito emerged into the state room at the Imperial Palace for the last time as emperor. He gave a final speech. Since ascending the throne 30 years ago, I have performed my duties as the emperor with a deep sense of trust in and respect for the people, and I consider myself most fortunate to have been able to do so. I sincerely thank the people who accepted and supported me in my role as the symbol of the state. I sincerely wish, together with the Empress, that the Reiwa era, which begins tomorrow, will be a stable and fruitful one, and I pray with all my heart for peace and happiness for all the people in Japan and around the world. At the Imperial Palace, the curtains are pulled back to reveal the emperor sitting atop the throne, wearing a rust-colored sokutai, a traditional Japanese outfit worn in the imperial court, which originated in the Heian period. The emperor repeats the motions of a ceremony which dates back thousands of years, continuing on the legacy of the oldest hereditary dynasty in the world. Under the Constitution of Japan, the emperor is defined as the symbol of the Japanese state and the unity of the Japanese people.
Leonardo drawings, but it's in Japanese, which is is that the best bit to look at?
Ma'am, yes, there's
These are some of the drawings by Leonardo, yes.
Although there have been a number of empress regnants, especially during the Nara period, since the Showa period, only male children can inherit the throne. 2,600 years since its inception, the Imperial House of Japan is facing a new kind of crisis, a crisis of succession. Male members of the royal family are allowed to marry a woman from outside and bring her into the family and become royalty. If an imperial princess marries a commoner, she must renounce her titles. As imperial house law dictates that only men can ascend to the Chrysanthemum throne. Therefore, unless they marry a member of their extended family, are stripped of their royal titles and become commoners themselves. This has caused a dwindling number of royal babies born into the imperial house, questioning the succession of the millennia-old dynasty. Princess Mako's recent wedding once again highlighted the shrinking number of members of the Japanese imperial family and raised the question of whether to amend the law to allow female members to retain their royal titles upon marrying. and whether a woman will be allowed once more to sit on the Chrysanthemum throne.
本日天皇陛下のお許しをいただき、婚約が内定いたしましたことを誠に嬉しく思っております。小室さんは私を温かく励ましてくださる存在でございます。
From their mystic origins to the symbol of the unity of the Japanese people, the Yamato dynasty has remained relevant and at the center of the religion and culture of Japan.
公祝委員会三村明夫会長より主催者式辞を申し上げました。
国民の幸せと世界の平和を常に願い、
It is yet to be seen how long the world's oldest continuous hereditary monarchy and last emperors will retain their hallowed place on the millennia-old Chrysanthemum throne.